So we've now had the dulcet tones of recording in progress, so it's a good point for us to kick off. Welcome everybody. It's with great pleasure that I welcome everyone to this afternoon's edition of our Connecting with Nature series. My name's Gary Dunnett. I'm the Executive Officer of the National Parks Association. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're all meeting on Aboriginal lands. I'm on the Durrell lands in the southern part of Sydney, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Today marks a bit of a pivot point in our Connecting with Nature series. The last several have been during lockdown, and we were very determined to make them as buoyant and positive as possible. So you've learned a lot about how to freeze dry your spag bog so that it doesn't weigh too much in your backpack for overnight trips. But we haven't really been going to the heart of some of the controversies and challenges of nature in New South Wales over this period, because we felt that people needed to sort of needed a little bit more of a positive outlook. But today we are actually going to one of those really substantial emerging questions about the future of our protected areas across Australia. And though we're going to be starting in New South Wales, this really is a national issue. And it goes to the question of really what our national parks are for. Are they purely for the protection of nature and cultural values with appropriate recreation, or are they also places that people do business? Today, I'm really delighted that we've got James McCormack joining us. James is the editor of Wild Magazine. Many of you I know will have read his article on this question of luxury lodges and commercial development, which was published last year, but I'm really looking forward to hearing what James has got to say. The format's going to be a little bit different today, in that we'll have an initial presentation by James, then David Gallen from our Far South Coast branch is going to talk about the Light to Light proposal, which is a long distance walk in Ben Boyd National Park, and one that MPA's had a number of concerns about the level of impact and the, if you like, the alienation of the public domain that's happening through that. But today is really an opportunity to crank up asking questions of the panel. So if you just hover your computer mouse over the bottom of the screen, you'll see that there's both a chat and a question and answer tag. If you want to make comments on the presentation, by all means put them under the chat. But if you want to ask a question that we can come back to in the discussion, please put that down in the question and answer, and the panel will do our best to answer your questions. So look, on that note, please make use of the that question function, and I'm going to pass on to James to talk to us about luxury lodges, wilderness lost. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks New South Wales MPA for letting me speak today. First of all, I will make an apology, and that is that, as you can see, I've lost my front tooth. I just had a mountain biking accident a couple of weeks ago, took out the front tooth and smashed up my face. So I apologize for that, and for the COVID hair as well. I'm yet to get a haircut. So I apologize for my appearance. So I think, first of all, one thing that I really wanted to stress with these lodges is it seems an unusual spot with an unusual spot to have all these ideological tensions. Now, for those of you who, I'm not sure that everyone will have read my stories. In fact, I'm not sure whether most or whether some of you have. So for those who've read, you may well be familiar with some of this stuff that I'm going to cover. But if you haven't read it, then or hopefully this will be interesting anyway. But one thing I did want to say, that when we're talking about the core issues at stake here, it's actually surprisingly broad and surprisingly deep, and it really does strike at the heart of our worldviews. So you're looking at the tensions between private and public, between rich and poor, between industrial and natural, materialism versus spirituality, development versus wilderness, exploitation versus conservation, luxury versus stoicism, and dependence versus independence. So they're actually some really deep philosophical issues at play here. One of the other things I wanted to say at the beginning was I actually just wanted to talk about a few of my biases. Now, I know not everyone's probably going to agree with everything I say, so that's fair enough. Everyone has their own opinion, but I just thought I'd make explicit or at least some of my biases coming into this, and that is that I personally believe there should be no private infrastructure in national parks. I want to be clear that I'm not saying no business. What I'm saying is no private infrastructure. And there is a caveat to that. Like if you're talking about there's an old, gatekeeper's cottage in a national park, then yes, obviously just leaving it empty seems crazy, but no new development, no new private infrastructure being built. Public infrastructure or public parks should be for, if anything's going to be in there, should be for public infrastructure. The other thing is that I'm not anti-business. If you think about one of the arguments that's been put forward over the decades by the conservation movement, it's that there's more money to be saved or more money to be made by saving trees than by logging them. And implicit in that is that there is an economic value to conserving our public lands. So I'm definitely not anti-business, and I'm not anti-luxury either. I have, believe it or not, stayed in some 5-star digs in my time and quite enjoyed them. And I don't mind a bit of luxury myself. My wife wished I liked it a little bit more, but still, I'm not against luxury. And I'm neither pro nor anti huts. I think it's really worthwhile me saying that, because I can see in certain instances there can be a place for public huts, but I guess the big difference is here. I'm not, well, first of all, I'll add that I'm not actually boosting huts and saying that huts should be built everywhere, but I'm certainly more receptive to people talking about, hey, wouldn't it be good if we had a hut here? And when I'm talking about huts, I'm literally talking about huts, like small, simple infrastructure. But then the big thing with a lot of these proposals that are happening around the country is that they're not just huts. These are far bigger developments than anything you would possibly conceive as being a hut, and far more luxurious than you ever might think of as being a hut. Some of them are huge. If you look at some of the buildings in the Three Capes development, which is probably the development that kicked off this wave of other lodge developments around the country. But you're talking about structures or series of structures that are 100 meters in length. We're not talking just your quaint little hut in the woods. When you're thinking of, a lot of people think of huts, they might think of down in Kosciuszko National Park and think of the old bushman's huts there. These are just at such a diametrically opposite end of the scale that they can't be talked of as huts. But still, even so, occasionally I will still throw out huts instead of lodges. The other thing is they're extremely plush, but also they're expensive. Often some of the ones in the Three Capes, you're talking basically $1,000 a night. That's a lot of money, and with a lot of money means there's big profits, and it's that search for profits that's basically driving this process. So then in terms of places where these are happening, so I've just mentioned Three Capes, which kind of kicked it off, although in reality, the real place that kicked it off was the Overland Track. And but I mean, quite frankly, I think a lot of people would say, look, if it just stayed at the Overland Track, I think a lot of people would have been fine with that. But once it began going into this new model with the Three Capes, where they were building completely new tracks, explicitly for use by these lodges and spending many millions of dollars to do so, it set off this new wave of development. So down in Tasmania, which seems to be the point of the spear with a lot of this stuff, you've got the Three Capes, you've got there's developments at Lake Malbina where they want to build on an island in the middle of the World Heritage Area. There's new developments at Cradle Mountain being proposed. There's extra developments being proposed on the overland track. There's a string of lodges being proposed for the South Coast track in Tasmania, and the South Coast track is a walk that is absolutely defined by its challenge and wilderness, and to put a string of lodges through that would completely change the character of the area. There's also developments that are being proposed at Frenchman's Cap, at the Walls of Jerusalem. There's another one in the Tyndalls that's been in the news a bit lately. But then looking around the country, look, Queensland has had some where you've got just recently there was the track up around the Scenic Rim that started last year, the Spicer Scenic Rim track, which has private lodges all through it. But there's proposals for developing the Thorsburn Trail and the Kalula Great Walk, and also the Ngaro track in the Whitsundays. South Australia has had a track being proposed and lodges being proposed in Kangaroo Island. Victoria has the Falls to Hotham walk, and that is another really problematic walk, or string of developments there. And in New South Wales, we've had developments as well being proposed. But one thing I wanted to touch on for those who haven't read my story, the thing that kind of really got my blood boiling with this in the first place was I went to go and walk the Green Gully track up in kind of the mid-north coast, Coffs Harbour hinterland. And when I went to do it, I was looking for something to do with my son, essentially, who at the time was 6. And I saw this walk and had heard about it and thought, it seemed nice enough, maybe I'll check it out. And found out, yes, there's not lodges, but there's these huts along it. And then the cost to stay in the huts at the time was $600. But the website was saying, if you don't stay in the huts, there is no way of doing this walk. You cannot camp. You cannot do the walk on your own. I thought, this has to be a mistake. So I rang the ranger, one of the local rangers there, and they said, unfortunately, no. Like, if you don't pay to do this, if you don't pay your $600, you can't do the walk. Now, I've since gone and studied a bit more that you can actually, as long as you stay 200 meters off the track, go and camp wherever in that particular national park. But most people aren't going to go through the effort of wading into plans of management to find out what they can and can't do when the website explicitly says you can't camp or you can't do this walk unless you pay the money. Now that $600 has now gone up to $900. And people will say that, it's still not that much. If you get 6 people in there, you could, it's only $150 each. Well, the thing is that if you're doing it as a couple, like me and my son, and you see you're talking one adult and one child, it's still $900. That's a fair bit of money for a lot of people to pay. And it's totally exclusionary. And as I said, what's particularly egregious about that is that you can't go and camp anywhere on the walk. Now, with the Light to Light track, I will briefly, before I just mention the Light to Light track, there's also the proposal for the Great Southern Walk here in New South Wales, which has some concerning elements as well, but maybe some hope as well. So I'd like to talk about that later. But the other big one in New South Wales is the Light to Light track, and that has definitely got many, many, many concerning elements. And actually, I'll pass over to Dave Gallen here, who can just talk a bit about what's actually being proposed and where we're at with the Light to Light walk.
Thanks, James. Yeah, and I'm speaking from Dirrangarra country, Tathra, place of the wildcats in the Dirrangarra language. Yeah, look, I can understand all those viewpoints, James, and yeah, I solidly back every one of that idea of exclusion. And that's how this first proposal for Light to Light was moved. And it certainly has a lot of people upset. In the very early days, National Parks Association, we had a briefing before the public submission process started, and our very first sort of line in the sand was complete rejection of what was happening in proposed for Walls of Jerusalem National Park. We had this luxury lodge proposed for a little island and people helicoptering in and out. I mean, someone who's really enjoyed over decades, scores of years, multi-week walks in Tasmanian wilderness, just reject that outright. I mean, the whole concept of wilderness nowadays is it's becoming more and more valuable. When those World Heritage areas were being declared in the 80s, you know, there were cries from business. But I mean, if you go today, conservationists have vindicated that businesses are really built on the status of that World Heritage area, because wilderness has become a very rare commodity. So this Light to Light walk had a public exhibition, and it did include sort of many exclusive features. It's entailing wholesale changes to the track to include a lot more ocean views, and 6 twin share huts and 3 8-share huts, plus associated infrastructure to be implemented. This is in a landscape with a lot of heath. You know, it's these huts will be quite visible. So 205 people responded to the first public exhibition, and Parks said, "This confirmed the high level of interest in the proposal," unquote. In our last submission, we rejected that because it reported that only a small number supported the building of the huts in this section of what's known broadly as the Wilderness Coast. People said to me last weekend, those 205 submissions, they were not an indication of support for the proposal or an interest in the proposal. It was an indication of their love of the park and their concerns of how that park would be developed. Now, we made a case that all of us have used huts in the overland track. We've used various facilities like that. I've used huts, very isolated huts, you know, Dusky Sound. You get about, well, in the 80s, you get about, 100 people a year over elements of that Dusky Sound track. But I walked through snow on Christmas Day in the Dusky Sound. It was an 8-day walk by myself. And so huts in alpine areas, or as you said, James, historical huts that have already been built, you can understand that the need for those in terms of safety. Now, there were some concessions made after that first proposal, and it went on public exhibition. They said that there would be no privatisation of the huts, so that complies with your viewpoint, and that's certainly one we would agree with, that any infrastructure should be controlled by parks. And we made the point that there's some quite good development already in the park. Places like Batangabi, that's a real jewel. It's got quite a large footprint. People can take their camper vans in there. People can park and put their bivvy bags or tents, further away from the car. And there's some quite decent plans to enhance the cultural area that exists there at the moment and close off some the road access or the road loop to control some of the erosion. That makes complete sense to make it an even better place. But, for instance, in some of the Batangabi, they want to completely reroute the track to, again, bring in water views on the pretense that it's saving erosion, which we don't think that case is made, especially when the new track will be longer and go through threatened species habitat as identified by their very own surveys. So we also rejected the idea that someone would be coming in and running the walks, and it's not just people who've been walking this track for decades that reject that. We've also got business owners. So local papers have run the concerns just even the past couple of weeks about business owners. There's one quote here. It says, "The plan supposedly includes stakeholders from a broad section of the community." This person says, "I run a licensed operation at the National Park. And I know other local businesses that operate there. And from my understanding, none of us have been invited or included in the reference group. So our submission supported local businesses because, as we all know, national parks drive tourism, and there are lots of good accommodation sites outside the park. So we thought that was not so good. And like you, also concerned about this sort of the wealth that someone would have to have, the ready money to take part in some of these walks. So we asked recently, still, what is the cost? Because it hasn't been on public exhibition, and there's still no indication of what it would cost. But we're told it'd be along the lines of what happens with the Maya House, or the reference to the heritage accommodation at Green Cape. It's still very expensive, and it's so expensive. I've not used it, well, not paid for it. So, they, in the public exhibition, they say a key component to the successful hut-to-hut walk is it users experience a sense of immersion and remoteness, including a separation from other park activities. And they also say a hut-to-hut model is not intended to be elitist, but rather provide an alternative for a wider range of visitors to experience the Light to Light walk. But we make the case that the concept of separation here is not from other park activities as much as other park visitors. So in that sense, it is elitist. So it's just a great place. I think, Sam, you might just play a little bit of footage here from your screen, if you can.
Yep, I'll do that. I'll share now. Okay.
So I was camping the other day from Batangaby and exploring some of the walks, and then we went round to Green Cape Lighthouse.
Have you lost the image?
I can see it.
I can see it.
Great, because my monitor just died. That's good. Keep going.
Oh, and we had a pot of whale. We could hear these whales, out over the ocean before we could actually see some of them. And this is just 50 metres off Green Cape Lighthouse at the lookout there. So during the whaling season, people heavily booking the heritage features of Green Cape Lighthouse, and that's one of the things in our submission is that we've got this beautiful heritage site. It just looks sparkling. It's a historic lighthouse, and the accommodation, and the proposal is, we've got this, for 36 odd people. That using all those huts, they've got to end up somewhere. So we have to sort of put accommodation somewhere down at Green Cape. Well, our concept is we reject outright that all these new huts need to be in there. We've got lots of parking infrastructure and places where people can go. And if they are going to proceed, which they're probably likely to, it should be way less than half the number of huts and people. And that way they can easily accommodate them without any alterations to Green Cape. So anyway, that's just a little overview of Light to Light, how people are feeling about it, where it's at now, the great disappointment about it. And, we value that wilderness coast for its natural features, its scenic wonders. And, we just reject that these new huts to be installed, just not needed, and how unscenic they'd be. Thanks, James.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that, Dave. Yeah, it's a great shot of the whales. It's quite lucky to be there. Yeah. So just picking up on what Dave was talking about with equality of access. Like when I look around the country, and that's one of the things that needs to be clear here, because I was originally thinking about this I was originally thinking, like, looking at New South Wales, knew a bit of what was happening in Tasmania, but was knowing about this as a nationwide phenomenon. It's understanding that there are different levels of degrees in which equality of access will be disturbed. And one of the, so if you look at, say, the Scenic Rim Track in Queensland, I'm not saying I'm pro it, because I wasn't pro it at all, but still they did go around and actually create new areas for people to camp in. So you wouldn't be arguing necessarily on that one in terms of the new Scenic Rim Trail impeded access to people. But there were still issues with that, which I can get to in a bit. But at the other extreme, there are many developments that are actively impeding access. And, I just talked earlier about the Green Gully track. And if we go back again, looking at the Three Capes, which, kind of kicked all this off, they tried to stop all camping from independent bushwalkers going out onto the capes themselves, stop it completely. And it was only after many years of fighting and protesting and lobbying by the local Hobart bushwalkers who created the tracks in the first place, and kind of people began going out there following their tracks, that they managed to get reinstated some campsites. Now, we're not talking a lot of campsites. I think there's only 6 or so at each. I haven't actually done it myself, but they tried to basically stop independent bushwalkers going in entirely. If we look at the Light to Light track, the Light to Light walk, originally, as I understand it, at Mawari Point, there was always going to be huts, but bushwalkers were going to have to stay elsewhere. Independent bushwalkers would not be able to stay there and would instead be shunted to an area next to a car park and totally away from the wilderness experience. Now, that's changed probably because of some of the blowback they were getting. And I look at the current proposals from Mawari Point on the Light to Light, where there are campsites there. So at least that is an improvement, but it's only because of people fighting for it and telling them that they're not happy with the way the proposals were first put out there, that has changed. But still, there's other areas around the country where essentially independent bushwalking campers have been either excluded from going into an area that they've been historically able to go into, or will be shunted off to other areas. Now, part of it with that, it comes back to this whole thing of the profit. And this still includes the public run operations as well, because essentially they don't want people competing with these lodges. And it's never a great look if you've got someone paying $1,000 to being at a lodge, and 100 yards away you've got some stinky bushwalkers staying there for $3 or for free. They don't want that kind of competition. So that's why a lot of these developments will actively seek to exclude independent walkers. There's another thing that will happen frequently with this is that to preserve the experience for those high-paying light walk, they're talking about 36 guests per day. Now, obviously, there can be some ecological, good ecological reasons for doing this on occasion. So it's not like I would say, putting access number caps is always a bad thing, but it's also hard to not get over the feeling that this is often done to maintain the exclusionary feel of these lodges. And if you look at the Light to Light, where they're saying they're going to actually review the numbers after a while to see if there's a negative impact on the visitor or park experience. Well, if there is a negative experience, which numbers do you think are going to be cut first? The independent walkers who are paying nothing, or the walkers who are paying their, $200, $300, $400 a night? And that's just the Light to Light walk. It could be more, another place will be more expensive. In short, they're not going to cut the paying walkers to accommodate more independent walkers. It'll be the independent walkers that get squeezed. And actually with that, there's even, it's worthwhile noting, I was chatting with Jared McPhee of Victorian National Parks Association, and he made the point that even a lot of these campsites, when you go to, say, Larapinta, he's been hearing about it, but at other areas where you'll get private guiding companies coming in, and they will essentially book out all the campsites, months or a year in advance. So it makes it really hard for independent walkers to come in. Now, obviously that can be overcome by having quotas for independent versus guided walkers, but still that needs to be strictly maintained. So when you're looking at these, let's go back to the lodges. When you're looking at these lodges, if you do have a campsite nearby, but then half of those campsites are given over to other private groups, it really doesn't leave much for independent walkers. So as I said, it's not universal that you're having impacts on access, but it can be. And the problem is that once they get it in there, once bureaucrats get it in their head that this model is working, that you'll get more proposals around the country that will look at excluding access. And you can understand why the businesses want it. Like, they just don't want the competition. Now, the tragedy of all this is that a lot of these developments are being paid for by tax dollars. So the people, the very taxpayers, you and I, or whoever else is paying their tax dollars, that we pay our taxes, and then some of those tax dollars are then doled out to developers to exclude the very people who are paying the taxes to give these developers their money that they're spending. It is absolutely insane. It's craziness that some of these developments are being paid for by the general public. And the figures are really quite large. Like on the South Coast track, already, there's been $3 million was given to Ian Johnston for developing at least I think it was around $3 million was given to Ian Johnston for looking into developing the South Coast track. Some of the other funds that have been talked about. So in the NT, where there's a proposal to develop the Wataka track, that's looking at $5 million of public funds. $5 million again for the Whitsundays. For the Falls to Hotham Walk in Victoria, $15 million. And that's without a business case being done. They have not even done a business case, and yet they're saying, here's $15 million. When we look at the Three Capes track, $25 million. The Tyndalls track, $40 million. $40 million. These are eye-watering sums. And yet, so it's coming out of the public purse, and the money's being used to exclude the public. It's absolutely craziness. Now, these are huge sums to be thrown at any development, let alone a lot of these developments that only have single beneficiaries. It's quite mind-boggling that they're putting out this money, goes to a single company, and the jobs created aren't huge. Like Lake Malbina, for instance, they're talking about potentially as few as 3 full-time jobs. For the Tyndalls, with the $40 million, they're talking about potentially 39 full-time job equivalent, full-time jobs, or the equivalent of 39 full-time jobs. And I'm thinking, $40 million, 39 full-time jobs, why not just give them $1 million each and tell them to retire? At least they wouldn't be damaging the environment doing it. It's craziness. Anyway, but the other thing with all this, and part of the reason that it's kind of hard to know how much people are being excluded, is that people are kept in the dark. Like, locals are kept in the dark with what's been happening. One of the things I kept hearing when I chatted with people about the light to light was how difficult it was to understand what's actually happening. And even sometimes when people are given the right to comment, as happened recently with the light to light, you're given, there were 600 plus pages of reports being released, and people were given just 4 weeks to digest 600 pages and then make detailed comments. Like, that's not a lot of time to get through that many pages. But at least, I guess, in this case, they were given the chance. In a lot of cases, it's just all done in secrecy. I do know, particularly the Kangaroo Island in South Australia, that was one of the really big problems, that people just did not know what is happening. But even now with Tasmania, with the South Coast track, that again is people just don't know what's happening there either. It's really hard to find out what these proposals entail. So then, just moving on. Now, the other big, or not the other, because there's others as well. Another big thing is, or second major point, is this loss of wilderness. So it's, depending on your viewpoint, as big or the biggest issue here, or as big as the equality of access. But one of the things here is that if you put a wilderness lodge in a wilderness area, that is no longer wilderness because the lodge is there. A wilderness lodge, as I was chatting with Bob Brown about this, it's a non sequitur. They can't exist. It's either, if there's a lodge there, it's no longer wilderness. And the thing about wilderness is that, yes, it's a human constructed term. It's a problematic term given, the First Nations peoples here who obviously wouldn't be looking on any of this land as wilderness. But if we can, kind of for the time being, put aside the problematic nature of the term itself, it's hard to see how these developments don't have major impacts on wilderness, especially the scale of them. Like, again, if we look at Mawarri Point, I understand there's 13 structures being built there. That 13 structures is a mini village. Structures being built, and some of them quite large. At each not a dozen or so structures in the whole development, a dozen or so structures at each accommodation node, as they like to put it. The same Kangaroo Island, you're talking like large amounts, clusters of buildings. And if it turns out that it's not a large amount of smaller buildings, then it's one huge building kind of going together. So these strings of structures actually have quite large visual impacts. And it's hard to get over the fact that when you're seeing, from some distance away, this cluster of villages, that won't impact on our sense of wilderness. And as I said, wilderness is a psychological term, and it is in the eye of the beholder, so to speak. And then there's the other big one here when it comes to wilderness is the sound impacts. Now, the thing about these lodges is that how are you going to service them? How do you move the food and grog and the bedding and to be frank, the guests' poo in and out of these places? And very often that's going to be by helicopter. And I read a piece recently where they were saying, the size of the lodge is this very small footprint. Even if that's the case, the helicopters servicing them have huge footprints. You're talking tens of thousands of hectares when you do flights backwards and forwards, and the sound impacts are enormous. And the acoustic component of wilderness is really important. When we go out there and we're in an area that we think of as wilderness, we don't want to hear choppers buzzing overhead. Now, I guess you could say that's selfish. Can't you just put up with it? But it really absolutely impacts upon what we regard as wilderness. And the places that you can go for an unbroken week or more and not hear the sound of a jet or a car or a generator or God knows what else, where for a week or more, you're only hearing, the howl of a dingo or the hoot of an owl or the crash of waves. Those places are becoming increasingly rare. And especially, and this is one of the big issues with the Tasmanian South Coast development, is that you'll be having choppers flying all over the southwest. And it would just completely change the wilderness nature of the southwest there. The other thing is, like with this, when we talk about loss of wilderness, it's not accidental. It is a deliberate loss of wilderness. Now, I'm going to just look at my notes here because I've got something quoted by Brett Godfrey. So Brett Godfrey is the head of the Australian Walking Company, and they are the mob who are in charge of the Three Capes track. It's a subsidiary there called the Tasmanian Walking Company, but the Australian Walking Company has tentacles all over the country in terms of developments being proposed. But anyway, he said that his target demographic was a 52-year-old single female who finds going into the wilderness not her cup of tea. So Godfrey's answer is not to take his clients to appropriate areas that might be their cup of tea. His answer is to just get rid of the wilderness element of it. But it goes further still, because when we talk about those helicopters sites, like being able to make these places comfortable to people, It's potentially like these choppers are going to be going everywhere, and I guess once it starts, it's really hard to stop. And I do know that I chat often with people in New Zealand, and New Zealand may be thrown out as an example of where lodges and huts work, and definitely to some extent they do. There's the Department of Conservation huts are great, but I also know there's actually a growing movement of people who are fighting against, or at least trying to get helicopter usage restricted, because it's really hard to go places where you're not hearing the sound of choppers, and I don't think everyone wants that here. And then the other thing is with choppers, once they're flying in grog and food and linen and poo in and out of these places, well, if they don't have enough money, if the lodges aren't making enough money, how long will it be till they just decide, hey, can't we just have a couple of guests fly along in the chopper with us? And then once they begin doing that, they can just begin using these things as accommodation hubs, out in the middle of what was once wilderness. You'll be able to fly people to locations that they'll just fly them in and out of by chopper, which is in some essence almost what's being proposed for Kosciuszko National Park, when has major problems there, that if you've got these choppers flying backwards and forwards. And as I said, like an individual chopper flight will have a sound footprint that's huge. And not only that, most of the time, the construction of the tracks, which they spend huge amounts of money on building these tracks and over-engineer them. But part of the main ways they're able to do that is via the use of choppers in the construction and construction with the huts. I'm going to look up the quote here. It was, I cannot find it. When they were building the Three Capes track, it was more than 17,000 individual chopper flights to build the track. 17,000. I went down last summer to Kosci. I was down walking there, and you could see choppers going backwards and forwards, setting up for the new track that's being built down there. But that was insane. 17,000 flights. So even if, for the 5 years they're constructing these tracks, that's 5 years of huge impacts from the sound of these things. Okay, but we'll move on beyond just loss of wilderness, because wilderness is, as I said, that's a psychological term. There's also, the straight ecological impacts of these lodges. You can't expect to put down a mini village in hitherto untouched areas and expect there to be no ecological impacts. There's the impact of land clearing itself. There'll be impacts on local animals there. But if you look back at there was an audit done by Tasmanian Parks and Wildlife last year on the huts, or I call them the huts, the lodges for the overland track operated by the Tasmanian Walking Company. And these are some of the problems they found in the audit. There was grey water filtration systems only partially installed, filtration bins not adequately sealed or not adequately secured or sealed. The outflows weren't clear liquid. There were overflows of high nutrient water from uncovered food waste bins. There was inadequate sand filtration. There was pipes clogged with grease. There was dead myrtle forest downstream from grey water treatment. There was evidence of patchy short-term repairs. There was algal growth and oils in waters at the drain sites. Native trees were being used for rubbish platforms, and the list goes on. And the scary thing is that these lodges are being cited as being subject to stringent environmental guidelines. I would hate to know what would be happening if they weren't. Now, to be fair, some of those things have been fixed, but it just gives an idea of some of the impacts that can be had. One thing also, and I touched on it earlier, was the level of construction with the tracks. And I hear frequently from people who've done the Three Capes track is that, wow, they just can't believe how engineered it is. And I am actually seeing a bit of it here I live right on the edge of the Royal National Park, and there's massive engineering of the track going on here. But part of this is that, especially when you're looking at potential developments like the South Coast track in Tasmania, a track that's defined by its challenge, is that if they're making this less challenging by putting in the lodges, how much also less challenging will they make it by the engineering they put into the track? Now, again, going back to the Three Capes, I keep on hearing that it's not a track, it's a path. It feels like this highly engineered path. You look, and so will you be having steps on these paths? Like, how much will these paths need to be defanged just to make them profitable, to allow the people who are after that kind of experience to make it possible for them to do? And the annoying thing is there's loads of opportunities for them elsewhere. If you don't like wilderness, you don't have to go into it. There are other options. But for those who do like it, then it's the defanging of paths to make it commercially appetizing is really hard. And the other thing is that I'm not going to lie, like, I think, and maybe this is selfish, that if you get to a hut, or let's say you walk to the top of a mountain, you climb to the top of a mountain, and you find up there, little to your knowledge, after all the hard work you put in, that there's a road up there and there's a hut, and everyone's staying in this hut and having a good time, and you put in all this work. There's no doubt that for some people going in there, and it probably shouldn't, like, but it definitely will. It will impact upon the way you feel about a place, knowing that you've worked so hard to get there, but that others have got there with no effort of their own. One of the things we often say in life in general was it was worth the effort. But if there's no effort involved, then that it changes the dynamics of that argument. Another cost here, and it's one that was I was talked with, again, people with the South Coast, with the Light to Light in particular, like chatting with John Blay and Kim Taysom and so on, and saying, look, one of the things that's interesting here will be the loss of spontaneity. The Light to Light walk, as it stands at the moment, you can go along and pick your own little spot to stay, and if you get to a spot at 11 a.m. and just go, you know what, this spot is awesome, I'm just going to set up camp here, I'm going to stay out an extra night, I'm just going to soak in the ambiance and have a bit of a, you could call it forest bathing, or a bit of a commune with nature. Well, those days will be gone once you're given no choice but to say, right, this night is here, this night is there, there's my third night, and they are the three your time there. So I'll quickly go on to, okay, given these impacts, why these developments proceeding. The big one that's thrown out there is jobs, but really jobs, it's a furphy. If you want to provide more jobs, you will easily have many more jobs being created if people have if people are carrying in gear for them. So let's say that you're spending your $1,000 a night to stay in a luxury lodge. If that $1,000 instead, well, you wouldn't even have to pay that much, instead went to paying for people who were porters carrying in your gear, for people who were doing your camp cooking for you, who set up your tents for you, so that you went in with no more than a tiny day pack, carrying like little more than a cheese sandwich and a hanky and a bottle of water. That is possible. There's many more jobs that could be created that way. And as I said, some of the numbers of jobs that are being created are actually quite small. On the other hand, if you have camp crews going in there, then you're going to be creating many more jobs. So the other thing is that when I'm saying people bring in stuff for them, staying in tents, you could actually set up very comfortable kind of large scale tents. Now, it's not to say that that is an unalloyed good, but still it would be possible to set up the tents, and leaving them as non-permanent structures. I'll just move on a little bit more a little bit more quickly.
James, we're sort of, I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So if we can wrap up quite quickly, please.
Okay. Yep. Great. Okay. So then I'll just add a couple. One more thing is that a lot of the time, what we don't hear about are the unsaid reasons besides jobs as to why these lodges are being created. And obviously the big one is profit. You know, it's funny how when they throw out proposals for these lodges, profit is rarely talked about. Neither is luxury. And it's funny that luxury is never talked about, because luxury, when you look at the pamphlets and the brochures associated with these lodges, the very first thing they talk about is luxury and hot showers and everything else. So look, I'll finish up there. There's definitely more to say. One of the things I've done I did my story in 2 installments because I hit 11,000 words of writing there on my story, and I could have easily doubled or tripled that, but unfortunately I think I'd probably bore people with that. But in 15 years of being a journalist, I'd never done anything of more than 10,000 words until I came to this story, and I felt that I left a load unsaid. There is, as I said, it comes because there's so many crucial worldviews competing here, coming together. There really is a lot to say. But anyway, look, we'll leave it there for the moment. And if anyone's got questions, I'd be happy to take some.
Thanks, James. And you've left us anything but bored. It's really thought-provoking. And I've got to say, it's sort of front and centre for MPA that how do we find that balance between the primary purpose of parks in terms of conservation and creating opportunities for people to actually experience them without degrading that primary purpose. So look, I'm going to exercise my MC's prerogative as usual and ask you the first question. You made a comment about, if you like, over specifying the quality of tracks to make them too easy.
Yeah.
And what I'm interested in is if you've got some thoughts on that balance, if you like, between high quality tracks and environmental impact. And if I sort of reflect on the first time I walked from Cockle Creek down in Tasmania to the south coast, it was prior to any sort of solid surface, and you had that classic situation of every boggy bit, there'd be all the braided tracks, which meant that, you know, you'd end up with 6 or 7 or 8 different pathways trying to get past a creek crossing. That was replaced with the most minimalist sort of set of track infrastructure you can imagine, which was literally just, you know, the 2 longitudinal planks. And it was really just whippersnip across the Buttongrass Plain. They didn't have to dig into it, but it created a surface that lets people float across. It is much easier from a physical point of view, but from my perspective, it vastly reduced the environmental impact that was happening just through the normal trampling through that landscape. So I'm keen if you've got some thoughts about how we get that balance right between not making it just a stroll down the park, but equally not having tracks that actually degrade the landscape.
Yeah. Well, I think that is it's a great point. But the thing is, the over engineering is massive, and I think, as I said, I just keep hearing time and time again about, you wouldn't believe how much it doesn't feel like a bushwalker's track when you do cape to cape. So I think, you know, when you're talking about the duck boards down in the south coast track, and you'll see them elsewhere as well, you know, that's quite minimalist, and I think is totally fine, you know, when you're hardening a track in that respect. But it's the sheer you know, beyond what any bushwalker would actually think of as a track. But one thing I'm just going to reach up to my bookshelf here. I just have this sitting here, this book here, and for anyone who's interested, I actually thoroughly recommend reading it. It's called On Trails by Robert Moore, and he's an American writer, but I wouldn't be able to find it instantly. But one thing he talked about in there was he goes out and meets trail builders and in the US, and we don't seem to see this phenomenon here that I'm just about to talk about, and that is this notion of trying to create a hard track that blends in with the environment so much that you have no idea of how much work went into it. You know, that these things are very sympathetic with the landscape. That yes, you know, you'll walk over, this is in the States, you'll walk over this section of track that may have had a large amount of work to get it up to the necessary standard, but people just walk over with zero idea because it just feels like it flows into the landscape. We don't have that in Australia. I'm yet to see it anywhere, really. This kind of mindset to specifically create tracks with the very notion that they blend in as sympathetically as possible with the landscape. I don't know, maybe they do exist and I just haven't walked on them yet, but I'm still yet to see them. And certainly I live on the edge of the Royal National Park. I'm in there at least 4 days a week, and every development I've seen there does not conform to that mindset at all.
Thanks. All right.
That's one of the things we said, Gary, in our Like the Light submission was chiseled rock steps. It's not appropriate this century. You know, last century you can understand in difficult mountainous territory where there's just one route, but you know, a little bit of rock scrambling is completely understandable, and you know, for any capable mobile person, retirees do it all the time down our way.
Yeah. Actually, I will add something else, because this is one thing that has bugged me no end in the Royal National Park here. So again, not related to lodges, but it is symptomatic of some of the over-engineering that you will see, especially as more tracks get developed to accommodate these lodge developments. And if anyone who's familiar with the coast track, you might know there was a flat section where you get above Werrong Lookout before you get to the Garrawarra Road. And it's about 500 meters that was in absolutely pristine condition. You would look at it and think, how can so many people walk on this track and have such minimal erosional impact? Like, you look at it and go, that is astoundingly solid. How can that be possible? And yet they've recently covered it all in plastic boardwalking. And, you know, it's only probably 500 meters of this otherwise perfect track, but 500 meters of boardwalking would have probably cost them, you know, a couple of $100,000 to put in there when you look at the overall cost of the track. Money that couple of $100,000 could have been spent on weed control or invasive species control, or done something far better there. And all I can think of is that when the Royal Coast Track is done, that you will not be touching foot on dirt for nearly the entirety of the track. Now that again will take us back to, is this the type of thing that will become more common when you've got in lodges and people are demanding, hey, well, this track is too difficult, we need to make it easy, because the people who are wanting, you know, 5-course meals and showers and soft beds while they're out in the bush are probably the ones who will be complaining about tracks being too hard.
Thanks, James. I'm going to move forward to a question from Marlene, or a bit of a question and observation, who talked about seeing a group of school kids in Moreton who are being led by a commercial tour operator. And she's asking whether you see taking a group like that in, particularly on a commercial basis, as overuse of the park.
Obviously it would depend on the particular area, but in general, no. I mean, I you know, for me, the big thing is, are you building permanent infrastructure? And so as I said at the beginning with my biases, is that I'm not anti-business. I mean, yes, you know, unbridled business can have its problems, but I'm not saying that national parks should be exclusionary of all business. And as I've said at the outset, is that we in the conservation movement have long argued that there's more money to be made by leaving trees in the ground and encouraging conservation. So implicitly that is saying, you know, you can make money there, and we shouldn't be against people making money there.
Thanks. Question from Nigel, which I think is very relevant given you're living on the edge of Royal National Park, which is your views on the unauthorised construction of mountain bike tracks and the environmental damage associated with those. And I think in Nigel's question, let's test the question of whether mountain bike tracks have a greater impact than if you like, the older generation of walking tracks?
Yeah, for me to answer that. Look, I mean, personally, I would say no. I mean, I think they're 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. When I look at, say, some of the track that I just talked about, the coast track above Werrong, the second you get off that level bit and begin going down into palm jungle, it is horrifically eroded. There is, and that's the annoying thing, that they haven't worked on fixing that. You can see that this needs work. There's been horrendous damage. There are no mountain bikers in that area, like just absolutely zero. So this is purely done by walkers. Now you can conversely find areas where mountain bikers have gone into, and they too have created erosion and created problems. But then you can find other sections of track, like I'm a mountain biker and I ride on the tracks around here, not so much in the Royal, but I ride elsewhere because I live on the southern end. And if I go down to some areas kind of near Bulli, you look at the track there and you're going, wow, this has absolutely no more impact than any walking track in the area. Like, and there's certainly been many studies done show that in and of itself, mountain biking isn't more damaging to the environment. The whole question is numbers. Like if you have numbers that are, if you have many numbers of either mountain bikers or walkers going in there, they're going to cause damage either way. The one thing I would say with unauthorized mountain bike tracks is that because they're unauthorized, a lot of the time they don't get maintained properly. And that's where a lot of problems lie. Like if you don't build a track that is maintained properly, then damage will result. So that is the big issue with unauthorized tracks. Someone threw out to me a good example of, if you had your foot on the ground, if you had your hand on the track, which would you rather have hit your hand? Would it be a horse's hoof, a ranger's boot, or a mountain bike wheel rolling over it? And nearly everyone would probably prefer to have the mountain bike wheel roll over their hand than any of the others. So anyway, but it's a vexed question. Like it's a tough one.
We might move a little bit further south then. Sam has, looking at the Great Southern Walk proposal and noting that a lot of the accommodation that's proposed on park actually ends up undermining off-park businesses, accommodation businesses, and asking the question, have you got any ideas about how we can recruit the local businesses to oppose that on-park component of accommodation?
Yeah. Well, so we're talking the Great Southern Walk, not light to light. Yeah, okay. The Great Southern Walk, I actually, and this is a thing where I think it's kind of interesting, because the Great Southern Walk running from Kurnell to Bulli as it stands, it may end up running longer than Bulli. But interestingly, you've actually got several villages on the way along with Sublime Point. So you've got Bundina that has plenty of accommodation options at the moment. You've got the village of Otford, which is where I live, or next to Otford, and you've got Stanwell Park, and then you've also already got development around Sublime Point. Now, all those places could safely have development for walkers that would not undermine the characteristic of the national park. And this is why I would see, this is what makes, for me, the light to light so annoying, is that you're building development there to encourage this track, when you could, with this Great Southern Walk, limit your development to those 4 towns or 3 villages plus Sublime Point that are already developed, so you can have great walkers accommodation in these places that's outside national parks, that has very little impact. And with the one caveat being that national parks is also, as part of this Great Southern Walk proposal, proposing glamping and cabins at Wadamola. Now, that I'm against, but I think that if you were marketing this walk to say that you stay at Bundina and you spend one night in a tent at Wadamola, and then you're again back into luxury in Otford and Stanwell Park and at Sublime Point, I think that most walkers would actually kind of find their one night in a tent exciting, knowing that they got to shower the night before and shower the night after. Yeah. Their one night wouldn't hurt them. And so it's actually potentially a great example of how things can be done to have the accommodation outside the national park. Now, that depends on things that depends that they could be done that way. Now, that's not necessarily what they're proposing, and that is a worry for businesses, that when they're saying, hey, let's build these places within national parks instead of using the accommodation that exists outside, which does hurt those businesses. And that's one of the things when we talk about jobs, what's often not talked about is the jobs that will be lost. And this is particularly the case in Flinders Chase down in Kangaroo Island, where there's whole business models that have been set up of people taking walkers into and out of the national park, so staying off-park accommodation. Those places will struggle once there's in-accommodation parks, once there's in-park accommodation. So I think it is something that's just not talked about much at all, and needs to be considered when they are talking about jobs, that it will cost jobs outside the park.
Yeah, and look, I've got to say, from a policy point of view, it's the thing that's probably most galling to MPA, in that we've got the current Minister for Environment and even the former Premier standing in the public arena saying that national parks are contributing $19 billion a day, a year to the New South Wales
19.5 billion
economy. And that's not glamping in parks, that's the existing visitor base, and the fact that people are visiting those local towns and staying in that existing accommodation, and we're potentially endangering that contribution by changing the character of access to the parks.
Well, the other thing I actually want to add to that is that, and this is one of the things that people throw out with lodges, is that, oh, but parks need the money, and so we need to allow lodges. Well, the thing is that there's actually they contribute virtually nothing to the park economies. Now, one thing that came out recently was with the Three Capes track in Tasmania, where the government, remember, spent $25 million, but were leasing out sections to the lodges for 1 cent a quarter. Now, you tell me how that's a good return on your money being spent. In fact, this is it's costing money. This isn't giving money to national parks, it's taking money away from them, because every cent that's spent on that $25 million, I hear throughout Tasmania, at least I hear anecdotally, throughout Tasmania, that the track development and track maintenance elsewhere dried up for 5 years during that period that they were building the track. So this doesn't give money to national parks. And the other thing is that, going back to this funding for national parks are paying their way already. With that, if they're contributing 19.5 billion. Why should they need to do more? As I said, but not that these lodges contribute much anyway.
All right, that feels like a really good note to finish up this afternoon's proceedings. James, Dave, I really want to thank both of you for leading us through this discussion today. It is a really provocative topic. It's absolute sort of wheelhouse for MPA. And I know from speaking to our colleagues in other national parks associations across Australia that it's a live issue across the nation. So I doubt this is going to be the last time we come back to this one. But James, you've given us a great start. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Gary, could I just add something? And that is that, please, because there's loads I didn't get to talk about. So if you do get the chance and have the appetite to learn more, I urge you to go to Wild's website, wild.com.au, and you'll find stuff about the story there that you can read. You can ingest all 11,000 words of the stories that I've written so far.
All right. Well, look, just to assure you, we make these webinars available through our website, and we'll add the link to Wild Magazine to that as well. All right. Thanks, everybody.